What if the person sitting in front of you, accused of a crime, wasn't who they appeared to be? Jordan Taylor, a 17-year-old facing serious charges, remains eerily calm throughout the trial. But is there more to his story than meets the eye? As the truth unfolds, the courtroom is shaken. What will happen when everything changes in an instant? Watch until the end to find out. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more shocking stories. The courtroom was a place of silence, save for the rhythmic tapping of the gavel that echoed through the room. Judge Evelyn Harris sat at the bench, her fingers lightly resting on the polished surface of her desk. The room was heavy with the weight of anticipation, a sense of inevitability hanging in the air. Another day, another routine case was about to begin. Another young person, another broken system. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in, as if they too could feel the burden of cases like this, cases that came and went without ever changing anything. The murmurs of the few onlookers and the shuffle of papers seemed like a distant hum as the judge's gavel struck once more. She looked down at the defendant sitting quietly at the table. Jordan Taylor, a 17-year-old black male, sat motionless, his eyes fixed forward. His face was unreadable, a mask of calmness that hid any hint of the nervousness or fear that typically gripped young defendants in moments like this. He had been accused of trespassing and theft, allegedly caught in an abandoned property. Nothing violent, nothing extreme. Just a crime that seemed routine enough to most, and one that many would see as an inevitable part of a young life caught in the system. There were no significant damages, no missing property that had been reported. Yet Jordan Taylor was here in this moment, awaiting his fate. His posture was unnervingly still, his hands folded neatly in front of him, almost as if he were preparing for something much bigger than this. This wasn't just a trial for him. It was the beginning of something larger. Judge Evelyn Harris observed him, noting the lack of the typical emotions she usually saw: fear, anger, defiance, or the exhausting weariness of those who had been through this process too many times. Jordan didn't seem to fit the mold of what she had come to expect. He wasn't like the others who had walked through the doors of her courtroom, and something about that unsettled her. She had presided over countless cases like this, young black men caught in the system before they even had a chance. Some were truly guilty, some were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But she had seen enough to know that the system was rarely fair, and even more rarely just. As the case began, she couldn't shake the feeling that this young man, was somehow different. The routine might be the same, but there was something about Jordan Taylor that made her pause, a question that lingered in the back of her mind, a sense that things were never as simple as they appeared. The courtroom settled into an expectant quiet as prosecutor Daniel Cruz stood confidently at the podium. He adjusted his tie, a clear signal of his professional demeanor, and began his opening statements with deliberate precision. His voice, sharp and unwavering, cut through the stillness of the room. "Your Honor," Cruz began, his gaze briefly flicking to the defendant Jordan Taylor, "this case is straightforward. The defendant, Jordan Taylor, trespassed on an abandoned property and committed theft, taking valuable materials. This is not a minor infraction, it is a serious crime, and we must hold individuals accountable for their actions." Cruz paused, his gaze now fixed on Jordan, who remained silent, his face expressionless. He was found inside an abandoned building stripping copper wire, a valuable asset. This is a clear violation of the law, and it cannot be overlooked. The prosecutor's voice grew more insistent, his words carefully chosen to resonate in the minds of the jurors and spectators. If we allow this type of behavior to go unpunished, we risk sending the wrong message. If people can break into properties without consequence, what does that say about our system? What does it say to those who follow the law? Judge Harris sat back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the desk. She was used to the rhetoric, the usual appeal to the need for law and order. Yet, as Cruz spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that his words were more about a moral stance than actual legal reasoning. The simplicity of the argument left her questioning how easily it was to make someone like Jordan, a young black man, fit into this narrative of criminality. She had heard this argument before: criminalize the behavior, punish the offender. But there was something different about this case. When the prosecutor finished, Isabel Martin, the defense attorney, stood up to present her argument. Her tone was calm but firm, and she moved to the podium with quiet confidence. She wasted no time in refuting the charges. "Your Honor," Isabel began, "this property was abandoned. There was no clear ownership, no reports of stolen goods, and no evidence to suggest that anything of value was taken. The prosecution claims theft, but without proof of ownership, without proof of loss, the charge doesn't hold." She paused to let her words sink in, then continued. "Being found in an abandoned warehouse does not make someone a criminal. There was no intent to harm, no evidence of damage, and no stolen property to speak of. The prosecution's case is built on a flimsy foundation. It's not enough to say that Jordan was there. Without concrete evidence, these charges should not stand." Isabel's argument was concise and logical, standing in stark contrast to the emotional appeals of the prosecution. She wasn't here to play to the gallery. She was here to ensure the law was followed, and the law demanded proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Through all of this, Judge Harris's eyes never left Jordan. His stillness unnerved her. He wasn't fidgeting like many defendants. There was no visible anxiety. His posture remained rigid, controlled. She found herself studying him more than the arguments being made, her mind racing with questions. Why wasn't he reacting? Was it indifference, or was there something more beneath the surface? The more she observed, the more she felt that Jordan was different from the others she had seen. The courtroom remained tense as all eyes were on Jordan Taylor, the 17-year-old defendant sitting silently at the table. The usual signs of anxiety, nervous fidgeting or shifting in the chair, were absent. Instead, Jordan sat still, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression calm and composed. The room seemed to hold its breath as the moment arrived for him to speak. Judge Evelyn Harris, still taking in the atmosphere of the room, addressed him directly. "Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice firm, "why were you at the abandoned property?" Jordan's response came without hesitation. His voice was steady and matter-of-fact. "I was doing my job," he said simply. A ripple of surprise spread through the courtroom. Judge Harris paused, her gaze fixed on him. This was not the answer she had anticipated. Most defendants would try to explain, deny, or justify their actions. But Jordan's response was straightforward, almost too simple. "Your job," Judge Harris repeated, pressing for clarification. "What job?" Jordan maintained eye contact, his demeanor unchanged. "Yes, ma'am. My real job," he said, his tone unwavering. The room went silent. No one knew what to make of his statement. The prosecutor, Daniel Cruz, quickly stepped forward, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "Your real job," Cruz scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You expect us to believe that? You were caught stealing copper wire from an abandoned property. How is that your job?" Jordan's calmness only seemed to irritate Cruz further. He leaned over the table, pointing toward the defendant. "That's not a job, Mr. Taylor. That's theft." Judge Harris felt the weight of the prosecutor's words, but she couldn't ignore the strange sense of certainty in Jordan's response. It wasn't the response of someone caught in a lie. It was the kind of response someone might give if they knew they had nothing to fear. She glanced at Jordan again, her curiosity growing. "What exactly do you mean by your real job?" she asked, her voice now more probing, trying to understand his unshakable calm. Jordan didn't falter. "Maybe you should ask the officer who arrested me," he said, his voice steady. Before Judge Harris could respond, the courtroom door swung open, breaking the mounting tension. All eyes turned toward the entrance as Detective Jason Blake, a seasoned officer known for his sharp demeanor, walked in. His presence was commanding, and the weight of his appearance seemed to shift the energy in the room. Blake's eyes met Jordan's for a brief moment before turning toward Judge Harris. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, "there's something you need to know about Mr. Taylor before you proceed." The room grew still, the air thick with anticipation. Even Cruz looked taken aback. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, frustrated by the interruption. Blake stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Judge Harris. "I apologize for the disruption, Your Honor, but there has been a misunderstanding regarding Mr. Taylor's identity. I believe it's crucial to clarify this before we proceed." A sense of confusion swept through the room, and Jordan's calm expression remained as unchanged as ever. It was clear to everyone in the room that the case was about to take a turn, one that no one had anticipated. The courtroom was stunned into silence as Detective Jason Blake stood before Judge Harris, his presence commanding attention. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words was undeniable. "Your Honor," Blake began, "there has been a serious misunderstanding regarding Mr. Taylor's identity. What you're dealing with here is not a criminal, but an undercover police officer. His arrest was a mistake." The words sent a shockwave through the room. Judge Harris blinked in disbelief, glancing between Blake and Jordan, who remained seated with an unreadable expression. The prosecutor, Daniel Cruz, was speechless, struggling to process the revelation. "A 17-year-old working undercover," Cruz scoffed, laughing in disbelief. "This is a joke, right? How is that possible?" Blake remained steady. "Mr. Taylor is part of a specialized intelligence unit. His assignment is to investigate racial profiling and corruption within law enforcement. He was documenting the treatment of black suspects, not committing a crime." Cruz, flustered, couldn't believe what he was hearing. "A teenager working undercover," he repeated, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "That's absurd." Blake didn't flinch. "Yes, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Taylor was there to observe how the system treats young black men, particularly when racial bias is involved. His presence wasn't illegal, it was part of his job." Judge Harris processed the information, her mind racing. She had thought this was a simple case of theft, but now everything had changed. Jordan, who had sat so calmly, was not a criminal at all. He was part of a larger investigation into systemic issues within law enforcement. Jordan spoke, his voice steady as ever. "I work with an intelligence unit, Your Honor. My job is to observe how people like me are treated by law enforcement. I wasn't breaking the law. I was observing how the system works." The courtroom fell silent as his words settled in. Even Cruz, still processing the revelation, was left speechless. The case had taken a sudden, unexpected turn, revealing far more than anyone had anticipated. Judge Harris sat back in her chair, realizing that this case was no longer just about a crime. It was about exposing the deeper issues within the justice system. Judge Evelyn Harris sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. Just moments ago, she had been ready to sentence Jordan Taylor for a crime he hadn't committed. Now, after hearing Detective Blake's revelation, she realized the truth. Jordan wasn't a criminal at all. He was an undercover officer, part of a mission to expose racial profiling and corruption within law enforcement. The weight of the mistake she had nearly made hit her hard. The courtroom was silent, everyone awaiting her decision. Jordan, sitting at the defendant's table, remained calm and composed. He wasn't angry or smug. He wasn't celebrating. He simply accepted the situation with quiet dignity. It was a stark contrast to the way most defendants would act under the same circumstances. His calmness made her think deeply about how quickly she had been ready to judge him based on nothing more than assumptions shaped by the system. Finally, Judge Harris spoke, her voice steady but filled with the weight of her realization. "Mr. Taylor," she began, meeting his gaze, "I am dismissing all charges against you." Jordan rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate, not in defiance but in simple acceptance. There was no celebration in his eyes, only quiet acknowledgement of the decision. He wasn't seeking validation or approval. He was simply standing as he always had, calm and assured. "Thank you, Your Honor," Jordan said softly, "but I don't need your thanks." Judge Harris's brow furrowed slightly, confused by his response. "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Jordan turned toward her, his voice steady and confident. "I believe in change," he said. "Not necessarily the system. It's hard to change something that big, but people can change. They can choose to see things differently, to act differently. I'm not here to change the system overnight, but I want people to change. I want people to understand." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Judge Harris began to see the deeper meaning behind them. She had always thought that being impartial meant simply following the law, applying it to every case the same way. But now, she understood that fairness was not just about enforcing rules. It was about confronting the biases she carried with her, and the biases built into the system itself. Jordan's quiet conviction made her realize that true change would not come from laws or policies alone. It had to come from the people who enforced those laws and the way they saw the world. His words struck a chord deep within her, and for the first time in a long while, she questioned her own role in the system. How many others had she been quick to judge based on assumptions about their race, their appearance, or their background? How many lives had she affected because of those assumptions? Jordan moved toward the door, but before he left, he paused and turned back toward her. His gaze was steady as he spoke one final time. "One day, Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but intense, "maybe someone like me won't need a badge to be heard." His words lingered, and Judge Harris was left in silence, reflecting on the bigger picture. The system needed change, but it was the people within it who had the power to bring that change about. Jordan had shown her that change didn't start with the system, it started with individuals. And she, too, had a role to play. As Jordan left the courtroom, Judge Harris sat alone, reflecting on what had just happened. The case had forced her to confront not just her own biases, but the larger flaws in the system she had sworn to uphold. She couldn't change the system alone, but she could change how she approached it, one case at a time. And from now on, she would strive to see the people in her courtroom as more than just defendants. She would see them as individuals, worthy of fairness, dignity, and understanding. Judge Evelyn Harris sat alone in the courtroom, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her. The case with Jordan Taylor had forced her to confront something she had never fully acknowledged before, the biases within herself and the legal system. It had always been so easy to believe that justice was simply about applying the law impartially, following the rules, and delivering fair outcomes based on the facts. But now, after everything that had unfolded, she understood that the law was not just a set of rules to be followed. It was a system that could be shaped by the people who implemented it, and those people had their own biases, prejudices, and assumptions. She realized that not only did the legal system need to change, but the people within it needed to change their mindset as well. Too often, They judged others by their appearance, their background, or their race. They made assumptions based on things that had nothing to do with the facts of the case. Judge Harris had fallen into that trap, and now she saw how easily it could happen. The more she thought about it, the more she questioned whether real change was even possible. The system was so entrenched, so deeply rooted in the way things had always been. Could it really change? Could people like her, who were part of the system, change enough to make a meaningful difference? Judge Harris took a deep breath, trying to process the flood of emotions and thoughts swirling in her mind. Could she make a change, even if it was small? Could she, as one individual, make a difference in the way justice was delivered? And more importantly, could she do so in a way that would affect those who came after her? As she sat there, she understood that the answer wasn't simple, but it was clear. Change had to begin with people choosing to see others as individuals, not as stereotypes. It had to start with self-awareness, with the willingness to confront biases, and with the courage to make decisions that reflected fairness and humanity, not assumptions. The story of Jordan Taylor had reminded her that justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about how the law served the people it was meant to protect. And it was up to individuals within the system to make sure that the law served everyone equally, no matter their background, appearance, or race. For the first time in years, Judge Harris felt like she had learned something truly valuable, something that would shape the way she saw her role in the legal system moving forward. Justice wasn't just a matter of rules, it was a matter of the heart. And the heart of justice lay in fairness, empathy, and understanding,